Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at the non-specific response to infection that we have. This is one of two videos I'm going to do on immunity for AS and A2. There is an aspect to this particular video on phagocytosis, but I have done a whole separate video on that with much greater depth and detail. So this is more just of an overview, really comparing it to the specific response that we all have to infection. Now, when we compare it to the specific response, there are two key things we have to consider here. One is that this is immediate. So we all have an immediate non-specific response to a particular infection or microbe causing infection. But also, the response that we have is the same for all pathogens. So regardless of whether it's bacterial, fungal, viral, we have the same response. And there are two real key things we need to consider when we look at the non-specific response. One of them are the physical barriers that we have. And the other one is, as I've said, something called phagocytosis. Now, I'm going to primarily focus on this top one for the moment. So, when we think physical barriers, we're actually thinking things like skin, for example, actual physical structures that we have in our bodies to stop infection from getting into our body, essentially, or making us ill. So what we're going to do is we're going to consider the routes of entry that these pathogens have, and then I'm going to look at the defense mechanism that we actually have to prevent said entry. So the first one we're going to consider is through the skin and eyes. So let's consider the skin and eyes as a possible route of entry. Now, the defense mechanism that we have against that are the fact that we have normal flora of microorganisms present on the skin. We also have them lining the digestive tract and the vagina. And what they do is compete with potential pathogens for sites on our bodies and nutrients. Now, the cells in the outer layer of the skin contain a protein called keratin, and it's these keratin fibres that make the cells tough and virtually impermeable to microbes. The reason why I included eyes in here is because tear fluid contains lysozyme enzymes that actually destroy bacteria. So we'll just make a note that, so for skin, what we're looking at are normal flora, and these compete with pathogens for sites in our bodies. We've got the keratin, which makes our cells tough and virtually impermeable, and then the tear fluid containing enzymes that destroy bacteria. So we'll put here tear fluid. So there's one potential route of entry through the skin and the eyes. Let's look at number two, and number two is via the digestive system. So, what defense mechanisms do we have in place to prevent infection via the digestive system? Well, we've got the stomach, and that produces strong hydrochloric acid, which kills most of the microbes. And that is actually the key thing to mention in an exam question. So, all we have to include here is we'll just write stomach acid. And that's our key non-specific physical barrier against infection via the digestive system. Let's look at a third potential route of entry, and that third potential route of entry is via the respiratory system. Let's put that one in place there. Now, with the respiratory system, what you find is that the whole respiratory tract is lined with mucus and cilia, which trap bacteria before they reach the lungs. So essentially, we've got mucus and cilia. And I'll just draw over to the side a quick sketch of what we're talking about here for number 3. So what we've got here I'll just draw these on the top here. So we've got a very simple quick sketch here of a ciliated epithelial cell lining the respiratory tract. We've got the cilia here at the top. So these are the small hairs lining the respiratory tract. We've got goblet cell here, and a goblet cell is what produces this mucus. So you can see this mucus will trap dirt and pathogens, and the cilia waft that mucus to the top of the throat, where it's swallowed, and then, coincidentally, this stomach acid can then work on that mucus and kill any invading pathogens. So a little bit of extra detail there for number 3, the respiratory system. That leads us into number 4. And number 4, as the route of entry, is the reproductive system. So just to recap, all of these are non-specific physical barriers that we have to infection. They're immediate defences, and it's the same for all pathogens, same for all people. We all have these particular responses. So let's consider the reproductive system. What you've actually got is harmless bacteria in the reproductive passages themselves, and what they do is create an unfavourable acidic environment for other pathogens. And this has a bit of a limited effect. So what we're looking at there is an unfavourable acidic environment. So now let's consider the final route of entry, and this is via vectors or carriers of particular pathogens. Now, interestingly, we have no natural defences to stop insects sucking our blood, but I've included it as a route of entry here just because that is one. For example, if you're asked an examination question on physical barriers that we have, or equally routes of entry of particular pathogens, that's one you can include. But what we're really considering, when we consider non-specific barriers, we're looking at through the skin and eyes, the mechanisms we have through the digestive system, through the respiratory system, and via our reproductive system. So there's some examples of the physical barriers that we have. But as I said at the top, we also have phagocytosis. Now, phagocytosis is one of the defences that we have against particular pathogens. So there are two main types of white blood cell that are worthy of mention: lymphocytes and phagocytes. Now, phagocytosis is the breakdown of large particles, such as pathogens, by phagocytes before they cause harm. Now, what actually happens is they're engulfed within vesicles on which digestive enzymes act. You've got histamine, which is released, and that causes dilation of the blood vessels, and that gets phagocytes to the site of infection quicker. Now, what you find is that you actually get a bit of inflammation, and pus forms. Now, pus is just simply dead pathogen and phagocytes. So, as I said, if you want to know a little bit more about phagocytosis, you can watch the video, Mr. Explains Phagocytosis, and it will go into much more detail about the actual mechanism of the formation of the phagosome and the phagolysosome, and how those pathogens are engulfed. One thing just to quickly finish on. When we consider the non-specific response, and particularly phagocytosis, one of the questions I get asked is, how does the body actually know which cells are theirs, which are their own, and which ones aren't? So how does your body recognise that a pathogen, an invading pathogen, actually is what's called a foreign material? And the answer to that is that proteins on the surface of cells with specific tertiary structures actually allow the immune system to identify a number of things. They can identify pathogens and the toxins that they produce, non-self cells from organisms of the same species. They can also recognise abnormal cells such as cancer cells. Now, an interesting thing just to finish on, in utero, so a developing baby, for example, infection of the fetus is actually rare as it's protected by the mother. Now, many of the body, or somatic cells as they're really called, however, have proteins on their surface with complementary shapes to white blood cells designed to destroy them. So the question you might ask is, how then does the fetus ensure that it isn't essentially destroyed whilst it's developing? And the answer is that at any given time, you have approximately 10 million white blood cells or so, called the T and B lymphocytes. So I referred to them earlier when I talked about lymphocytes and phagocytes. Now, these lymphocytes are capable of distinguishing between self and foreign cells. Now, in the fetus, those lymphocytes which have receptors that fit the body's own cells are usually suppressed or actually die early on, so that the lymphocytes remaining respond only to foreign material. So that is how your body is able to actually recognise which cells are yours, which ones aren't. And as I said, this first video is just about the non-specific response that we have to said pathogens. It's immediate, it's the same for all. And in the second video, what I'm going to do is look more at the specific response, because the specific response is much slower, but it's longer lasting, and it is specific to each particular antigen. Okay, hope all that helps.